Welcome back to Kafka Internal's Crashcasts. I'm your host, Sheila, and today we're continuing our journey through the fundamentals of Kafka. We're in the Introduction to Kafka chapter, and we'll be diving into the basic architecture overview of Kafka. Victor, are you ready to help our listeners understand the inner workings of this powerful distributed streaming platform?
Absolutely, Sheila. I'm excited to break down Kafka's architecture for our listeners. It's a fascinating system that's revolutionized how we handle real-time data streams.
Great. Before we dive in, let's start with a quick quiz for our listeners. Here's the question. In Kafka's architecture, what component is responsible for storing and managing topics? Is it A, producers, B, consumers, C, brokers, or D, zookeeper? Think about it, and we'll reveal the answer at the end of the episode.
That's an excellent question, Sheila. It really gets to the heart of Kafka's architecture. I'm curious to see how many of our listeners can get this right. It's not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance.
Indeed. Now let's start with the basics. Victor, can you give us a high-level overview of Kafka's architecture?
Certainly. At its core, Kafka is a distributed streaming platform. Think of it as a super-efficient, fault-tolerant postal system for data. The main components are brokers, producers, consumers, and topics. Brokers are like post offices, topics are like different types of mail categories, producers are the senders, and consumers are the recipients.
That's a great analogy. So, if I understand correctly, the brokers are the central piece where all the data is stored and managed, right?
Exactly right, Sheila. Brokers are the backbone of Kafka's architecture. They're responsible for receiving, storing, and serving data to consumers. But here's where it gets interesting. Kafka doesn't just use one broker. It uses a cluster of brokers to achieve high scalability and fault tolerance.
Fascinating. So how do these brokers work together in a cluster?
Great question. In a Kafka cluster, each broker is identified by a unique ID. One of these brokers is designated as the controller, which is responsible for administrative operations, like assigning partitions to brokers and monitoring for broker failures. The data itself is divided into topics, and each topic is split into partitions that are distributed across the brokers.
That's really interesting. You mentioned topics and partitions. Can you explain a bit more about what these are and how they fit into the architecture?
Of course, topics are like categories or feed names to which data is published. Each topic is divided into partitions, which are the units of parallelism in Kafka. Partitions allow Kafka to distribute data across multiple brokers, enabling parallel processing and high throughput. Each partition is an ordered, immutable sequence of records that is continually appended to.
I see. So if topics are like mail categories in our postal system analogy, partitions would be like different sorting bins for each category, distributed across multiple post offices.
That's a great way to put it, Sheila. And just like in a postal system where multiple people can send and receive mail simultaneously, Kafka allows multiple producers to write to topics and multiple consumers to read from topics in parallel.
Now we've talked about brokers, topics, and partitions. Where do producers and consumers fit into this architecture?
Producers and consumers are the clients in Kafka's architecture. Producers publish data to topics of their choice. They can choose which partition to send a record to, or they can let Kafka decide based on a partitioning strategy. Consumers, on the other hand, read data from topics by subscribing to one or more topics and processing the feed of published records.
That makes sense. But how does Kafka ensure that all these components work together smoothly?
That's where Zookeeper comes in. Zookeeper is a centralized service for maintaining configuration information, naming, providing distributed synchronization, and providing group services. It helps in managing the Kafka cluster, electing a controller, and in the overall coordination between different components.
Interesting. I've heard that Kafka is moving away from Zookeeper to something called Craft. Can you briefly touch on that?
You're right, Sheila. Kafka is indeed transitioning to K-Raft, Kafka Raft, to remove the dependency on Zookeeper. This change aims to simplify Kafka's architecture and improve its scalability. However, as this is still in progress, most production Kafka clusters still use Zookeeper.
Thank you, Victor. This overview really helps in understanding how Kafka's architecture enables its high throughput and fault tolerance. Can you give us a real-world example of how this architecture is implemented?
Certainly. Let's take the example of a large e-commerce platform. They might use Kafka to handle real-time order processing. Each order could be a message published to an orders topic. This topic could be partitioned based on product categories. Multiple instances of the order processing service act as consumers, reading from these partitions in parallel. This setup allows the platform to handle millions of orders per second, with the ability to easily scale by adding more brokers or consumers as needed.
That's a great example, Victor. It really illustrates how Kafka's architecture can be applied in a high-stakes, high-volume environment. Now, before we wrap up, let's reveal the answer to our quiz question. The correct answer is C, brokers. Brokers are indeed responsible for storing and managing topics in Kafka's architecture.
Exactly right, Sheila. Brokers are the central piece of Kafka's architecture, managing the storage and distribution of data across the system.
Thank you, Victor, for this enlightening discussion. To summarize the main points for our listeners: 1. Kafka's architecture consists of brokers, topics, partitions, producers, and consumers. 2. Brokers form a cluster and manage the storage and distribution of data. 3. Topics are categories of data that are split into partitions for parallel processing. 4. Producers write data to topics, while consumers read from topics. 5. Zookeeper, or Craft in the Future, helps coordinate the entire system. In our next episode, we'll be diving into the core concepts of Kafka, starting with a deeper look at topics and partitions. Don't miss it.
It's been a pleasure discussing Kafka's architecture, Sheila. I'm looking forward to our next deep dive.
Thanks for tuning in, listeners. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe to Kafka Internal's Crashcasts and leave us a rating. Your support helps us continue providing in-depth, accessible content about Kafka. Until next time, happy streaming.